When a woman vanishes from her Las Vegas home, investigators find themselves working to solve a carefully planned abduction and murder. A meticulous killer remains at large despite leaving DNA evidence behind in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up. This episode contains mention of sexual assault. We won't go into any graphic detail, but still, please listen with care. Theresa Insana was last seen alive on October 26, 2004. She was 26 years old at the time and lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. She'd been living and working there for several years, ever since she'd moved there with a friend when she'd been in her early 20s. Prior to that, she'd grown up in Niagara Falls, New York, where she'd lived with her parents and little sister. Their family was close-knit, and she'd had a very happy childhood. After high school, she'd earned a bachelor's in psychology from Binghamton University in Binghamton, New York. After graduating, she treated herself to a trip to the western U.S. and fell in love with Vegas, with its 24/7 energy and lively tourism industry. So in love that she decided that after living her entire life in New York, she was ready for someplace new and exciting. After returning home from her trip, she repacked her bags and gave her family the news. She'd be heading out west again, indefinitely this time. She was going to begin her young professional life in Vegas, where she'd embark upon a career in sales.
My first thought was Vegas, that's going to be a big city, a big change for her.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, I'm thinking she's used to like large crowds and tourists constantly flooding through the area. So it might not actually be all that shocking for her.
You know, you're right. Two very different environments, but at the same time, two parts of the country that attract a lot of tourists. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. Now, Theresa was charming, friendly, and ambitious, so neither the move nor her interest in a sales career came as a shock to those who knew her best. Her friends and family were sad to see her go, but confident in her ability to succeed at whatever she chose to do. Her personal motto, well known to her friends and family, was a classic: Carpe diem, seize the day, and that was exactly what she intended to do. After arriving in Vegas, Theresa landed an entry-level job in the sales department at the Harrah Casino on the Las Vegas Strip. There, she worked hard, and by 2004, she'd been promoted and transferred to a nearby sister hotel and casino, the Rio, where she was a sales manager. She thrived on the energy of working at a busy Vegas hotel and casino and truly enjoyed her work. However, not everything in her life had been going as smoothly as her professional ascent. About 2 years beforehand, in 2002, she'd fallen in love with one of her co-workers at the Rio, a guy named Jeff Fenton. Right off the bat, their relationship had been intense, what you might call a whirlwind romance. After just 3 months of dating, they were engaged.
Okay, even by Vegas standards, that's fast.
Yeah, it all happened very quickly, but Theresa was thrilled to be engaged to Jeff, and over time, they planned their wedding, eventually setting a date for the spring of 2004. The ceremony would occur back in Theresa's hometown of Niagara Falls. Only just weeks before the wedding was to occur, Jeff backed out. Theresa was totally taken aback and devastated. She'd been looking forward to the wedding so much and hadn't realized that Jeff had secretly been harboring reservations. Heartbroken, she considered moving back home to Niagara Falls, leaving Jeff and Vegas behind. Back in Niagara, her longtime best friend, a woman named Grace, was excited by the idea of her return. She missed Theresa, yes, but it was more than just that. She knew that she'd had her heart broken, and she really felt that she'd be able to heal much more effectively back home in New York than in Vegas, where working alongside her ex-fiancé meant being reminded of the breakup every single day.
Yeah, that would be a very tumultuous environment to be in, going through that. I can definitely see wanting to return to a quieter setting to recover from that.
Right, it was a tough situation to be in, so Theresa weighed her options thoughtfully, and ultimately she decided not to move back home. She'd just been promoted again at work, and even though the rejection had really hurt her, she didn't want to abandon a successful career and a city she loved over it. She was doing really well in Vegas. She just had to get over her broken engagement. Somehow, she'd make it happen. Now, besides being co-workers, Theresa and Jeff also shared another thing in common, a beloved dog. More specifically, a young Cocker Spaniel named Frankie. Jeff had given Frankie to Theresa as a birthday present when they'd still been together, so after their breakup, Frankie stayed with Theresa at her home. He was her dog, and she absolutely adored him. When Theresa was out of town, though, Jeff would come over and dog sit Frankie. So it wasn't as if Theresa and Jeff were estranged from each other, far from it. They still occasionally shared some responsibilities when it came to Frankie, and of course they saw each other frequently at work, which made it awkward when Jeff began dating another coworker at the Rio, a woman named Melissa. Despite the awkward situation, Theresa forged ahead with her efforts to move on. She even talked to a man who lived back in New York for a while, although they eventually decided that even though they liked each other, a long-distance relationship just wouldn't work for them. And then, on October 26th, about 6 months after Jeff had ended their engagement, Theresa vanished without warning.
Well, obviously, that 6-month time frame puts it into a very highly suspicious group of people.
Right. We're always talking about, in many episodes, that 1 year post-breakup period where if a woman is in an abusive relationship, and I'm not saying she was with Jeff, to the best of my knowledge, she wasn't, but if she is more likely to be harmed or killed within the 1 year post-breakup than she was when she was in the relationship.
Yeah. Anytime we're talking about someone going missing, it's always something that I take into consideration.
Mm-hmm. Now, when she failed to show up to work on October 27th, her coworkers immediately took notice. She'd always been a reliable and ambitious employee, and she had managerial responsibilities that she took very seriously. So being a no-call, no-show was totally out of character. One of her friends, a woman named Cynthia, went by her house that night to check on her, but when she knocked on the door, no one answered, and there was no sound of Frankie barking at the door either. There were no lights on in the house, so it seemed like no one was home. So Cynthia left. When Theresa failed to show up to work again the next day, her supervisor was worried enough that they notified casino security of Theresa's unexpected absence. That same day, 3 of her coworkers decided to actually go to her home in Summerlin to check on her. One of those coworkers was Jeff, her ex-fiancé. His girlfriend Melissa was another, and then there was another coworker of theirs named Brandon. Although Jeff had once lived in the house with Theresa, he no longer had a key to the home, so when she didn't answer the door, he, Melissa, and Brandon began searching for another way into the house. Eventually, they climbed over the garden wall, found that the house's sliding door was unlocked, and entered that way. Inside, there was no sign of Theresa, which was strange because her car was parked in the garage outside, and even more so because Frankie, the Cocker Spaniel, was there in the house. And judging by the mess, he had been trapped inside by himself for a couple days.
All of that is rightfully suspicious.
Yes, Jeff knew better than anyone that Theresa voluntarily abandoning Frankie was unthinkable. There was just no way that she'd leave town without arranging for his care, and she clearly had not. At this point, Jeff and the others called the Las Vegas police to report Theresa missing. When investigators arrived at her home, they noted that her purse and cell phone were both inside. According to reporting by Jill Cedarstrom for Oxygen, upon close inspection, investigators noticed 2 tiny blood drops in the bathroom of Theresa's home, one behind the toilet and one on the mirror. They also noticed that a towel rod was strangely missing. It looked like it had been ripped right out of the wall. They could see the holes in the drywall. And later, a friend of Theresa's would tell them that a bath mat and some towels that had been in the bathroom just a few days beforehand were also gone. Out in the garage, investigators found 2 more blood spots on the rear bumper of Theresa's car. Testing would later reveal that that blood was Theresa's.
Okay.
The blood evidence, while alarming, was pretty sparse, and that appeared to be because someone had cleaned the house. According to that Oxygen article, when investigators inspected the home, there were bottles of cleaning solution sitting out on a kitchen counter alongside paper towels and trash bags. Forensic investigators who searched the scene found matching glove prints both within the home and on Theresa's car. Specifically, they found them on the glass sliding door, on the kitchen sink, on the garbage bags kept beneath that sink, on the vehicle's exterior, and on a light fixture in the garage, which the killer had unscrewed the bulb from, presumably so they could move in darkness. The prints had a distinct texture, as they'd been made by gardening gloves, the type that have a textured palm that makes gripping things like plants easier.
Yeah. So with all of the efforts made to clean this scene. It doesn't sound like a heat of the moment kind of thing. This sounds almost premeditated and like it was methodically done and that they had planned to go in and clean before. And sounds like they did a rather good job of it too.
Yes, it does, and it was that way. This was not a spur-of-the-moment spontaneous crime. We'll get into even more details that demonstrate that this was carefully thought out.
Okay.
Inside the car, investigators noticed something else suspicious. The driver's seat had been pushed far back and lowered down as if somebody significantly taller than Theresa had been the last to drive the car. Theresa was very petite, only 4 feet 11 inches or about 149 centimeters tall, and not much more than 100 pounds in weight. Because of her short height, she was known not only to keep the driver's seat close to the wheel, as far up and forward as it could physically go, but to sit on a pillow as she drove to elevate herself even further. In light of these findings, investigators arranged search efforts. Searchers set out on foot, on horseback, and with the aid of tracking canines and human remains detection canines. Meanwhile, investigators spoke to those who knew Theresa and pieced together the timeline of her disappearance. They learned that on Tuesday the 26th, she'd left work early so that she could go vote in a local election. After that, she'd gone home and had walked Frankie, as she always did. She made some macaroni and cheese for dinner, called her best friend Grace, and left her a voicemail before calling her mom, who she spoke with for a little while. They talked about normal things like how Theresa's work was going and how some of their family members who were sick at the time were doing. Theresa stayed in close touch with her family, so phone calls like this were typical. When she ended the call with her mom, she told her she was tired and that she was going to eat the mac and cheese she'd made and then go to bed. Back in New York, Grace got Theresa's voicemail and called her back about an hour after Theresa had left that message. Theresa had asked her to give her a call, but when she did so, Theresa didn't answer. Around that same time at 7:30, a cousin of Theresa's called, and her call also went unanswered. Investigators believe that whatever happened to Theresa happened during the brief window of time between her call with her mom and the missed calls from her cousin and her best friend, Grace. Speaking of Grace, when investigators contacted her, she told them something that sent up red flags. According to what Grace told investigators then and later explained to Dateline, for a while before her disappearance, Theresa had suspected that someone may have been repeatedly entering her home and messing with her stuff while she was at work.
Okay, that's pretty alarming.
Yes, it is. Here's what Grace told Dateline, quote, I had went out there to visit her for a long weekend, and one of the days we were sitting in her house and she said, Grace, there's something weird that I feel that is going on here. Some days when I return from work, I turn on the television and it's not on the same channel that I left it on when I left for work. She felt that somebody had been in her house when she was not there. End quote.
That kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with her car and not moving the seat back. It's one of those little careless, overlooked things that shows somebody was almost too comfortable being in that space with her, and that they're overlooking these very common things that people wouldn't do, like not putting this TV back on the right channel so that to cover up the fact that they were being there. But at the same time, they're going to an extreme length to clean up and make sure that their DNA evidence isn't all over the place.
Right. You know, and I think that's what makes it so creepy, because someone being in your home and changing your TV channel, that implies that they were sitting around for a while, just kind of lounging and watching TV. It means that they were very comfortable and confident in invading your space.
I'll go ahead and say it. It's like they're entitled to that space.
Right. Now, Theresa's home, which was located in a quiet, family-oriented neighborhood on Cotton Willow Street in Summerlin, was not equipped with any kind of security or camera system. So unfortunately, there was no concrete evidence of this possible intruder, only Theresa's suspicions as relayed by her best friend, Grace. Unsurprisingly, when Grace learned that Theresa was missing, she was stricken with a gut feeling that something was very wrong. Theresa's parents were deeply worried too, so worried that they both immediately flew out of New York and to Vegas upon learning that she was missing. When they arrived, they began participating in the volunteer searches and handing out flyers. Meanwhile, police were busy canvassing the neighborhood, searching for Theresa and piecing together everything they could learn about her life leading up to her disappearance. Everyone who knew her said the same thing. Theresa loved the glitter and busy energy of working just off the strip, but she led a quiet, low-risk personal life. When not at work, she spent her time at home and in her neighborhood, which again was a generally safe one, walking her dog Frankie, resting, and staying in touch with her family and friends back in New York over the phone. She didn't party, she didn't abuse any substances or engage in any high-risk behaviors. Which of course made the evidence discovered at her home all the more strange. Investigators suspected, due largely to the blood evidence found in her bathroom and on the rear bumper of her car, that someone had violently abducted her from her home and had transported her elsewhere in her own car before returning it to the garage. And 6 days later, they were, unfortunately, proven correct. More on that next. And now back to Theresa's story. When 26-year-old Theresa vanished from her home in a quiet neighborhood, investigators quickly realized that she had likely been abducted from her home and that her abductor had likely used her own car to transport her to a secondary location before parking it back in the garage. There was evidence in the home, cleaning products, paper towels, and garbage bags, that suggested her abductor had tried to clean up the scene. And they had cleaned it up, but they'd missed those tiny blood drops in the bathroom and on the rear bumper of the car. After Theresa was reported missing, investigators arranged expansive search efforts, fearing the worst. And 6 days after she'd vanished, they finally found her. It wasn't police officers who made the initial discovery, but rather 2 construction workers who were doing some excavation near a culvert in a desert area that was being developed to make way for housing and shopping centers. There was a lot of construction going on in the area at the time, so the fact that construction workers were the first to notice something was not surprising. 3.5 miles, or about 5.5 kilometers from Theresa's home, they found her body in that culvert, half in and half out of the water. The culvert was adjacent to a golf course, and in order to place her body in the water, whoever had done so had had to cross rough, rocky terrain. According to reporting for Oxygen, because of this, investigators theorized that more than one person might have been involved in carrying her body into the culvert. Keep in mind, though, she was a very small person, so it also could have just been one strong person.
Yeah, we're not talking about somebody that's of an unmanageable size or weight here. I can definitely see somebody throwing her over their shoulder to get across this terrain without having too much difficulty.
Right. A relatively strong man could probably pull it off. Now, her body had been wrapped in towels and blankets taken from her own home, and there were footprints around it in the mud. Whether or not the footprints appeared to have been made by more than one individual, I'm not sure. I couldn't find any information sources that specified. In any case, the medical examiner who conducted Theresa's autopsy concluded that she had died of ligature strangulation. She'd also been extensively beaten all over her body and sexually assaulted. The manner of her death was, of course, homicide. One of the cold case detectives eventually assigned to Theresa's case, Detective Ken Hefner, would later, regarding Theresa's murder, tell the Las Vegas Review-Journal, quote, "She was in her house minding her own business, and somehow somebody comes in and kills her. She was one of those truly innocent victims." End quote.
My mind keeps going back to that sliding glass door.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering if it had an issue where it didn't lock properly, or if the lock had been tampered with in any way, and that's how they were getting in and out, because that's how her coworkers were able to get in. And it's obviously not something that somebody's going to lock on their way out. So I'm wondering if that was probably the primary method of entry.
I think that's likely. I mean, if this person really was regularly going into her house and chilling out and watching TV while she was at work, obviously they had a reliable method of entry. So either they had a key or something was being left unlocked. In the beginning, naturally, investigators working the case were quick to question Jeff and Melissa, especially Jeff. Given the situation, looking into the possibility of their involvement was a matter of course. Plus, investigators had noted that Jeff hadn't displayed much emotion regarding Theresa's death, which they found a little odd given their history together and the fact that Jeff wasn't known to be a particularly stoic guy. Now, on top of this, Theresa's friends told investigators that on the day of Theresa's death, she'd had some kind of argument with Jeff. So that obviously was a red flag to them.
He hasn't done himself any favors for not looking like a suspect at this point.
No, it's obvious why investigators pursued this theory perhaps before any others. Now, Jeff and Melissa were both cooperative with investigators' efforts, participating in the interviews they requested and giving DNA samples. Investigators also extensively searched Jeff's home for any sign that he had been involved in Theresa's murder. However, Jeff offered a solid alibi for the night of Theresa's death, and Melissa, who was by then pregnant with Jeff's child, by the way, was part of that alibi. On the evening of Theresa's murder, when she'd vanished after talking to her mom on the phone, Jeff and Melissa had been at a car dealership where they'd been buying a car together.
Okay, so at least it's not solely reliant on Melissa.
No, they had a good alibi. Now, investigators still asked both of them to participate in polygraph exams, which they did. While they showed no signs of deception when it came to most of the questions, when asked whether they'd known that Theresa was dead before her body had been found, they did both show signs of deception. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean anything at all. As we've said many times before on this show, polygraph exams are pseudoscientific. They're not very reliable. If you will, they are hot garbage.
I could easily see explaining that away by having a feeling that she was dead.
Or a fear.
Yeah. I'm not licensed to read these hot garbage tests, but I would assume that if you had those concerns or that fear, it would show up as an abnormal response.
I don't know if it would be typical for it to show up that way, but it's certainly possible because anything is possible with polygraph exams because, again, they are pseudoscientific. Now, on that note, Melissa didn't actually finish her polygraph exam. Rather, toward the end of it, she got upset and she hurried out of the room crying. Now, some people may view that as suspicious, but I'm not really on board with that because it sounds like a very stressful situation to be in, and I can see why this might upset someone. And for many women, pregnancy hormones can make one more susceptible than usual to emotional overwhelm.
And to be thrown into that situation in the role that she is, that's already going to make most people upset, I would say.
Right, extremely stressful situation. I don't necessarily think that her reaction was really out of the ordinary spectrum of reactions. Now, when it comes to Jeff and Melissa, they were definitely at the auto dealership together when Theresa is believed to have been abducted and murdered. Their alibi is solid. However, there is an episode of Dateline on this case that offers a theory that could still possibly involve them, a theory of murder for hire. As in, what if they had wanted Theresa out of their lives and had arranged and financed her killing rather than committing it themselves?
Okay.
As far as this theory goes, perhaps one or both of them could even have potentially been involved in the cleanup of the scene or moving her body into the culvert. Here's the thing about that theory, though. Theresa's murder doesn't seem like a crime of brutal practicality committed by a financially motivated killer. Rather, it bears the hallmarks of having been committed by an organized, sexually motivated offender who either knew Theresa well or stalked her during an extensive planning period.
The part that I latched onto with what you just said was the stalking part. Because it falls in line with feeling very comfortable in her house, feeling very entitled to her space, and feeling entitled to being able to access her. It's something that I'm much more confident following and a lead I'm much more comfortable with than murder for hire for this. And knowing about the brutality of the attack on her, it validates that even more.
I feel the same way. And this isn't just my opinion. It's also the opinion of Las Vegas Metropolitan PD's veteran cold case investigator, Dan Long. Last year, Detective Long participated in an interview about Theresa's case on an episode of a podcast actually that the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department makes themselves. It's their podcast. And of course, when you're trying to learn about a case, it does not get any better than hearing about it firsthand from an experienced investigator assigned to it. As you can surely imagine, his interview was a goldmine of facts and perspective on Theresa's case. For anyone interested in hearing Detective Long's take on the case firsthand, definitely check out that episode of the Las Vegas Metropolitan PD's podcast. We've linked to it in the show notes. And if you listen, you'll find that in that interview, Detective Long is clear about his belief that Theresa's killer was an organized, sexually motivated offender who either knew her very well or took the time to stalk her prior to killing her. And this makes sense. After all, would a financially motivated killer repeatedly sneak into her house to watch TV and mess with things in little ways that she'd later notice? Or beat her extensively over her entire body, even though their method of killing was ligature strangulation? Or sexually assault her?
Yeah, that sounds like two very different profiles. And while I'm not saying it's impossible that somebody other than the murderer was sneaking into her house and taking advantage of the space, I'm going to say that is highly unlikely.
Right. They probably wouldn't do those things. Those things, especially the severe beating and sexual assault, suggest emotional involvement in the murder. I agree with Detective Long's assessment that this crime was likely one that her killer had fantasized about for a long time before committing. Now, here's what Detective Long believes probably happened on the night of Theresa's death. That evening, she stepped outside through the sliding glass door into her backyard to smoke a cigarette, as she always did in the evenings. That's when her killer, who'd been lying in wait, sprang into action, forcing her back inside her home and into the bathroom where the deadly attack, including the sexual assault, likely occurred. During the attack, Theresa's camisole was torn and that towel rack was ripped out of the wall. Ultimately, the killer used a rope they'd brought with them to commit the fatal act of strangulation. Afterward, they wrapped her body in blankets and towels, placed it in the trunk of her own car, and used the car to transport her body to the culvert before returning it to the garage. Then they carefully cleaned up her home, unknowingly leaving a couple tiny drops of blood behind, and left, presumably via their own vehicle, which they'd parked somewhere nearby, or maybe on foot if they lived close enough for that to be a possibility. Either way, they would have taken a trash bag or two of cleanup materials along with them. Detective Long also mentioned an interesting detail about the case, which is that the culvert where Theresa's body was found was located in pretty close proximity to the house in which she'd previously lived. As we discussed earlier, at the time of her murder, Theresa was living alone in a house in Summerlin, which she'd previously shared with Jeff before their breakup. However, prior to her and Jeff ever even moving in together, she'd lived in a residence which she'd shared with a female roommate located in the 8600 block of Peace Way. Notably, that residence is located just a few blocks east of the culvert along Wallaby Way where her body was found. This may indicate that her killer was familiar not only with Theresa's final neighborhood, but with the one she'd lived in previously as well. And further support of this theory is the fact that the culvert her body was placed in is not visible from the road, meaning that someone unfamiliar with the area likely would have had no idea that it was there. Furthermore, in order to transport her body to the culvert, her killer had driven further into town to reach it, rather than farther out toward the outskirts or the desert, as one might expect a killer to do.
That does seem a little bit more pointed than I was initially going to give it credit for.
It's evident, I think, that Theresa's killer was a resident of the area. Perhaps they were even a current or past neighbor of hers.
It really wouldn't surprise me if she acquired somebody's attention that way when she first got there.
That's very possible, and for the record, Theresa was very beautiful, so I'm sure she caught people's eye all the time.
Just her physical size being so much smaller than the average person, that makes me think that somebody that was inclined to stalk her to such great extents, it wouldn't have surprised me that they saw her as somebody that would be easy to victimize.
Right, that could have been part of it, very much so. Now, there's one more thing I'd be remiss not to mention when it comes to discussion of Theresa's home, and that's the fact that at the time of her murder, she was actually planning to move out of the house she was living alone in and had previously shared with Jeff. In fact, the house was being shown to prospective future renters, so people, under the guidance of a rental agent or landlord, were occasionally being brought into Theresa's home while she was at work to view the property. Now, I know that may make you think, hey, she thought somebody was in her home. Maybe it was just these people being given a tour, but remember, she was aware of when they were coming in and out, and so she would have known, hey, maybe somebody was in here today, probably not watching her TV. That would be very strange. But despite this, she still thought that someone might be coming in and out. Now, whether or not that has anything to do with her death, I don't know, but certainly it could have been a potential way for someone with nefarious intent to have gained access to her home. In any case, when it comes to the identity of Theresa's killer, we can be reasonably certain that we're looking for someone who lived in the same area at the time of her death and who either knew her personally or familiarized themselves with her and her routine via stalking. That's not all we know, though. In fact, we know a lot more about this person because despite his meticulous cleanup efforts, he left his DNA behind at the scene. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the tiny blood droplets found on the rear bumper of Theresa's car turned out to be her own blood. However, that was not the case when it came to the tiny blood droplets in the bathroom. As it turned out, those blood droplets behind the toilet that her killer had missed belonged to the killer. At some point during the attack, he'd suffered an injury, which is very common during violent attacks. Naturally, investigators had the blood analyzed not just by local forensic professionals, but by a Virginia company we've mentioned in multiple past episodes, Parabon Labs.
The minute you said Virginia-based company, I knew exactly who you were going to talk about.
Yes. As we've mentioned before, Parabon Labs specializes in providing DNA phenotyping services to law enforcement agencies. That is, they carefully analyze DNA, often DNA found at crime scenes, and they use it to create a physical profile of the donor. They can tell investigators what the donor's racial and ethnic background is and what they look like. They can determine details such as likely eye color, hair color, skin tone, and even estimate some facial dimensions to a certain degree. And they use all of this information to create a digital portrait of the DNA donor. According to Parabon Labs' findings, the male DNA found at the scene came from a male of Southeast Asian, likely Filipino descent. His genes indicate that he has dark hair and eyes and fair or light brown skin tone with few or no freckles. You can see the digital portrait created by Parabon Labs for yourself on our website. The link is in the show notes. Obviously, having Theresa's killer's DNA on file is a huge boon for the investigation. However, investigators have not yet been able to put a name or identity to the DNA profile because it didn't match any of those in the CODIS database. Now, as we've discussed in many past episodes, CODIS is a large DNA database maintained by the FBI. A person's DNA can end up in CODIS in any of several ways, but the most common scenario is this. When a person is arrested for a certain type of crime, usually almost any felony crime, although the exact specifics can vary by state, a sample of their DNA is taken and uploaded into the database. So Theresa's killer's DNA not being present in CODIS means that he's probably never been arrested for a felony-level offense anywhere in the U.S., which means that despite having his DNA, investigators could really use help from the public. While they hope to possibly one day identify him via the use of familial DNA, that possibility is not guaranteed. So, cold case investigator Long has appealed to the public, asking for anyone who has any relevant information on the suspect to reach out to the Las Vegas Metropolitan PD's Homicide Unit. In that interview he gave, he stated that Theresa's killer, as killers so often do, may have moved out of the area immediately or soon after her death. He could have moved to another city or state or even another country, potentially the Philippines if he had connections there. And, disturbingly, he could possibly have offended again. Because as investigator Long pointed out in the interview, offenders who commit these sort of meticulously planned, sexually motivated murders are not likely to stop at one.
Just expanding on that, this is somebody that has great amounts of patience. They're not going to be messy or sloppy with this. Obviously, he had access to the house. He could have done this at any point, but he waited until he was confident enough to act on these feelings and this motivation.
Right. This is an organized offender, obviously at least relatively intelligent. He's less likely to be caught than a less intelligent, more impulsive, disorganized killer. So, in the wake of Theresa's murder, her family has kept her memory and spirit alive by establishing a scholarship in her honor. The scholarships are awarded to girls from Niagara Falls who've exhibited qualities that Theresa was known for, such as academic excellence and community service. Each year, the recipients and Theresa are honored at a special dinner where they're formally presented with their awards. So Theresa is still making a positive impact on the lives of others, even years after her death. Unfortunately, her dad passed away in 2021. He and Theresa had had a close bond, and he'd been a wonderful dad, so the fact that he died without answers compounds the cruelty and injustice that characterizes this case. In the present day, Theresa still has a variety of family members and friends who remember her with love and who are waiting to see justice served. If you know anything about the death of Theresa Insana, please call the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Homicide Section at 702-828-3521. or email them at homicide@lvmpd.com. If you wish to remain anonymous, you can call Crime Stoppers of Nevada at 702-385-5555. And if you found this episode to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved murder of Lindsay Harris. Her case is not related to Theresa's, but both she and Theresa were young women from New York who were murdered after moving to Las Vegas. We aired our episode on Lindsay's case in March of 2021. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Lasting Life. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastingalifepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we use to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Lasting Alive Podcast. Episodes of Lasting Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Theresa's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Lasting Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Lasting Alive is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.